It's been 6 years since the previous version of Poser, and just when it looked certain that the program was dead once and for all, it has been picked up by Bondware and a new version released. Bondware is a huge Poser and DAS content vendor, and the marriage between their content sales and their new acquisition seems to be a match made in heaven for those of us who still love Poser. Poser is a clear vehicle to drive their sales of Poser-specific content, enabling them to fight back at DAS's massive dominance in the content market. One of Bondware's first moves as owner was to build online shopping into Poser 11 and Poser Pro, a move that, whilst disappointing, was to be expected. They then published several patches enhancing the shop and fixing various bugs. At the latter part of 2020 they put out a call for beta testers, along with the announcement that they were going to release Poser 12. Bondware has made numerous serious and at times incomprehensible marketing missteps, but one feature that resonated loudly for me was the price. The program was to cost $249 standalone and $129.95 for the upgrade, and gone was the Pro version, which formerly cost over $400. $129 was cheap enough to take a chance on, but $249 when a, in many ways superior rival program was being given away for free, seems to be a tactically dubious move when your goal is clearly to provide a vehicle for selling content. Unlike previous owner Smith Micro, Bondware seems to be concentrating exclusively on its core market of hobbyist illustrators and animators, rather than broadening the program and ending up as a jack of all trades, master of none. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do a quick bullet point summary of the new features before digging into them in more detail. They are, in no particular order: faster rendering, adaptive sampling, post-FX, denoising, a new version of the Cycles render engine, optic support for more recent graphics cards, easier asset management, new material management, Python 3 support, improved compositing via shadow catcher, a HTML search system, new content, and automatic content installation. So, quite a handful, but the two that really stand out as significant and positive are the Intel denoiser and the new Cycles render engine. The denoiser is a fantastic feature that enables you to massively increase rendering speed. It basically smooths out noise in renders by intelligently averaging the pixel colours, filtering out what is known as Monte Carlo noise, an undesirable byproduct of ray tracing. This enables you to render at a much lower sample rate and then denoise the results up to a superior quality. For instance, where you might formerly have rendered at 30 samples in Superfly, with branch path turned off to get acceptable quality, you can now render at 5 samples with the denoiser turned on and achieve almost the same quality. I say almost because denoising does have a detail crushing component that can really create unwanted softening or blurring. It also shifts colours towards the red and can create unwanted saturation. However, it's an excellent improvement for fast previews and a dramatic improvement at higher sample rates of 15 to 25. Bondware's sample image in their marketing really undersells the feature. At this point, I'm just going to offer praise for a good Bondware marketing decision: a free, fully functional 3-week trial of the program. I had no intention of buying the program based upon their lackluster marketing, but seeing the denoiser in action was enough to convince me. Unfortunately, notwithstanding the inherent limitations of Intel's denoising algorithms, the most significant of which is temporal instability that can, but doesn't always, cause problems with animation, there are a whole bunch of other problems that are due to Bondware's broken implementation of the technology. For instance, if you render an animation, the denoiser does not work with anything but single frame saving. It cannot be applied to MP4 or even raw AVI saves. This is a massive limitation, which Bondware says it will eventually fix. But if I can briefly divert my diversion for a few moments, this highlights another massive problem. Poser has never released bug-free in any version, but this version has perhaps the greatest number of bugs of any release. I actively despise the game industry's early access mentality, where you pay for a broken product now and hopefully get a working one at some future time, or often never. If I am paying full price now, I want a fully functional product now. The last thing we need is the creative software going down this path. Rather than rushing this out for Christmas, Bondware should have beta tested far more comprehensively. Bondware says that it is adopting an agile software development methodology. Agile is a trendy new way of approaching software development, which in theory enables the company to rectify bugs and release new features much more easily and quicker. Only time will tell, but it still feels to me as though this is being used as justification for releasing a half-cooked product now on the promise of fixing and adding to it later. I'd also like to note that while previous versions released moderately small patches that fixed bugs iteratively, so far every fix of Poser 12 has required a download of the full 1.7 GB package, full uninstallation and full reinstallation of the program, which is massively wasteful of our time and bandwidth. Returning to the denoiser, it cannot be applied to an area render. Area render means that you can render just a rectangular part of the screen to check progress. A very common application is to perform a full screen render, make a change to the screen, then render just the changed part directly over the top of the former image, reducing postwork and compositing in Photoshop for instance. Unfortunately, the denoiser only applies to a full image or uninterrupted full image render, which drastically reduces its usefulness. The denoiser is applied as part of the new PostFX palette, which also offers the option to change exposure and saturation. These are both virtually useless as they are incredibly easy to apply in Photoshop or any other image editor. But I am hopeful that Bondware may add film grading options to this palette over time, enabling you to output specific film or lighting looks. It would have been even better if this offered plug-in architecture so that third parties could develop for the PostFX. Another feature that dramatically increases render speed is adaptive sampling. This is a terrific feature that applies more render processing only to those areas that need it, and can halve rendering times when activated. Generally speaking, well-lit areas without a lot of shadows or light bouncing or deflection do not need a high number of samples to achieve decent results. As soon as you turn the lights down or move into the shadows, the number of samples and consequently rendering time needed to achieve the same quality jumps dramatically. Why waste hours rendering the entire scene at 40, 50 or even more samples when only certain areas need it? Adaptive sampling can halve rendering times with no appreciable decrease in image quality. For owners of NVIDIA 2000 or 3000 series graphics cards, new optics support enhances render speed still further. Poser 11 does offer GPU-assisted rendering, which uses your graphics card's CUDA cores rather than your CPU to accelerate render speeds, but it does not take advantage of optics-based acceleration. Optics is found on the last two generations of ray trace capable graphics cards. I don't have an optics card to test, but Bondware claims a render time reduction of almost half on identical cards using optics over CUDA, and a gargantuan 4000% improvement over CPU rendering on a 3.2 GHz Intel i7 when using optics and adaptive sampling on an RTX 2070. I can only imagine the difference on an RTX 3090. Moving on, Poser now has a rendering engine based upon Cycles 1.2, the physically based rendering engine created by the Blender Foundation and found in the highly esteemed free open source Blender modeling and animation program. I couldn't find a comprehensive list of what features this updated version includes, but in addition to the denoiser, one of the most useful is the new principled node. For anyone who has attempted to build materials with cycles, you'll know that it's about as intuitive as a page of theoretical physics, and trying to build a material that includes features such as transparency, glossiness, subsurface scattering used in human skin, bump maps, etc. can be monstrously complicated. The new principled node gathers many of these features into a single node, very similar to the original Poser surface node, into which you simply plug maps and values, then connect a single output to the Cycles root node. One thing I can tell you is not present is Cycles' experimental support for microfacet displacement. Microfacet displacement is present in Poser's old Firefly renderer, and what it does is calculates displacement based upon the resolution of the displacement map, not the number of polygons in the geometry. If you want displacement with Poser's Superfly engine, you need to increase the number of polygons in the geometry using subdivision or modelling until it is fine enough to show the displacement. This means massively increasing the processor load, slowing down scene navigation. Although the improvements in Superfly render speeds over Firefly still equate to much faster rendering. Another mixed blessing with Superfly displacement is that you get much smoother results for the same resolution of displacement map, which can be useful, but not so much if you want sharp-edged displacement. Also, there is a hard upper limit on the number of subdivisions of 8 levels. A number of features have also been removed from Poser as they were deemed obsolete. Loss of the face room will not make anyone tearful, but removing Python 2, the scripting language, in favour of Python 3 is a choice with enormous implications. Many native and third-party tools were written in Python 2 and are no longer present or functional in Python 3. In fact, the Python scripts menu now looks very barren indeed. One of the more useful ones, Calculate DOF, which calculates the distance from the camera to an object for creating depth of field blur effects, is critical, and I'm amazed that Bondware didn't bother to rewrite it. Bondware claims that this Python update is to enhance security and future compatibility, but I've never heard of a single case where Poser's Python 2 implementation was exploited by hackers. I'm of the opinion if it wasn't broken, why fix it, especially when it comes at an absolutely massive cost in lost scripts. Far more critical in terms of loss is the incompatibility with third-party scripts, especially Snarly Gribbly's EasyDome and EasySkin scripts, which are considered essential by many users. Despite working on them for many months, he has yet to release Python 3 versions, and for that reason alone I do not recommend uninstalling Poser 11. The good news is the Python 3 installation does not interfere with the Python 2 Poser 11 install, so you can move back and forth between your programs as needed. All of the scenes created in Poser 11 are fully compatible with Poser 12. I've been gradually using EasySkin to convert my old character skins to Superfly compatible ones, but this Python incompatibility is even more incentive. I have also saved a standalone skydome in my props library that uses Snarly's EasyDome setup, although it's now harder to add lights that match the sun position. Python 2 was also used in some content to apply partial textures such as dirt and blood maps and tattoos, and it is doubtful that these products will continue to work. After I submitted this review script to Bondware for fact-checking, Bondware has just released a press release specifically addressing their choice to upgrade to Python 3, and frankly it's the biggest load of marketing BS I've ever read. The basic thrust of their case is that the previous version of Python was bad because it was easy to pirate, so scriptwriters gave away their scripts rather than sold them. Now Bondware is working with scriptwriters to include purchase verification via their store, so nobody can run a script that they haven't acquired legitimately. This is total garbage. The last thing Poser users need is a whole bunch of scripts checking their validity at launch or when used or installed. Moreover, every single item in the content library is simplicity itself to pirate. What about them? Daz3D tried software validation for purchases, and it was a dismal failure that they quickly abandoned because it penalised legitimate customers and caused a customer outcry. As a content creator who has lost tens of thousands of pounds to piracy websites, I'd love a simple solution, but Bondware has literally harmed every single legitimate user to protect the interests of a fraction of a percent of its creators. This move is totally self-serving, and I wouldn't be surprised if it was just the first step in a move to fingerprint all future purchases by Pythonizing all software going forwards. I don't see a way that it would work without radically changing the installer to an executable file format, and if Bondware starts that, it will be the end of their store. Poser 12 has a new material assignment section, which is an extra tab in the material room. The simple material tab has been removed, but in its place is the material assignment tab. The simple material tab was an ultra basic material assignment room that enabled you to assign diffuse, highlight, ambient, reflection, bump and transparency without having to delve into Poser's nodes. It was something that users quickly grew beyond, but had value for absolute beginners. The Material Assignment tab is also a simplified material assignment tool, but it works very differently. Before I explain, I should just clarify that a shader is a single texture, an eye colour for instance, whereas a material is a collection of shaders, all parts of a human body for example. In the material assignment panel, you select a material that you wish to assign a material to, then drag a material from the material library onto the right hand pane. You can then select which parts of the material will be applied to the figure. This is fantastic because it enables you to very easily mix and match shaders that were never intended for mixing and matching, enabling you to say add the eye colours from one material, the lips from another and so on. There is one massive caveat, and it will primarily affect those of you with a large library of legacy content. For the first 16 years of its life, it was the norm for Poser content to distribute one-click materials as pose files. This was a dirty file format hack that required coding to achieve, but it was the only way to distribute these files. In 2013, Smith Micro introduced the Material tab and the dedicated MAT format. This was a far easier way to distribute materials, requiring none of the special tools or coding that had previously been required. Poser 12's material assignment only accepts Material Room MAT files. The good news is that it's extremely easy to resave your old pose files, but the bad news is it's going to be a very time-consuming job and is the sort of task just crying out for a batch converter. Another small but surprisingly impactful improvement comes in the form of a slightly enhanced interface design. The figure control dials now show green dots next to them if the default values have been modified. This may seem almost inconsequential, but for example, when you are manually creating facial expressions and head shape, where there could be 50 or more dials open, quickly being able to see at a glance the ones that you have modified is a real boon. A second interface improvement is the addition of icons to content library thumbnails, indicating what type of content they are. Great, you may sarcastically think to yourself, a prop icon on everything in the props, a character icon for everything in characters. Genius. But how often have you run a search and wondered, is that a pose, a material or a prop? The only way to find out was to right-click an icon and use the Locate option to discover its location in your library. Now when you run searches you can tell at a glance what content is being shown. This would have been even more useful if it had also showed folder locations in the same way. As it is, you have to mouse over a folder and look at the tooltip to discover its location. Incidentally, the search feature seems to be a lot more comprehensive, discovering many more items than in Poser 11. Talking of file operations, the program's refresh option is still slow and can prevent you doing any other work while it runs. Suppose you are viewing your props library, then you install a new furniture set and Poser refreshes your entire library to update the new install. That refresh can take anything from a few minutes to half an hour depending on the amount of content you have and the speed of your system. During which time, many existing folders now show as empty, so you can't continue constructing your scene with other content while the directory is refreshed. Poser 12 also has a new super easy to use content installer. Discounting ancient DAS products which came as executable files, Poser content tends to be distributed in zip files. Bondware has added an Install from Zip Archive option to the File menu. This enables you to select a purchased piece of content and the program will give you the option which Poser runtime to install it to if you have more than one. Then it will install it for you automatically. It will then fully scan all directories to update them, which, in conjunction with the previously mentioned slow update, can be irritating. It would be nice if the program also supported the RAR file format, which many people use because it's more compact. But it would have been even nicer if it listed the library locations and names of the newly installed content, so that you can immediately find and start using it. Given that content is often buried beneath layers of vanity folder names, finding installed content can be a real pain, and often the only way is to manually open the zip file, search down through the runtime libraries and find out from there where the content producer has hidden the files, which somewhat defeats the object of a simplified installer. The manual has also been redone. Previously it came in the form of a few PDF files. I never had a problem with the format, but they are now replaced with HTML files. Each section is a single page, but they are all downloaded to your computer when you install. I was sceptical of the value of this, as Bondware claims that they are fully searchable and easier to navigate, but I must admit I'm pleasantly surprised to find that their claims are true, and the system is quite nimble to use. In theory, this makes it easier for Bondware to update individual pages, perhaps even going so far as to add something to the What's New page or adding a version notes page, hint hint. In reality, thanks to the aforementioned practice of redistributing the entire program with each patch, that benefit is lost, but hopefully Bondware will settle into a more user-friendly update and install routine, providing only content that needs updating. When it comes to interacting with other programs, the plugins have been discarded, but FBX, Collada and Alembic support makes it very easy to export animation, while OBJ and others enable model export. It's never been so easy to interact with third-party software such as Blender, 3D Studio and many others. Although the program no longer comes in a Pro and Standard version, it still has the Pro features. DAZ 3D also discarded their paid Pro version of DAZ Studio, so Bondware is wisely following in footsteps that were laid down before they acquired the program. I would argue that this makes it easier for everyone to make the content that is their core business, so it was a smart and well calculated move. Now let's talk about some omissions. The most significant is support for DAZ's Genesis figures. Poser users have been screaming out for this ever since the divergence between the two programs, and Bondware's claims that this is because they are not allowed to support the format is at best disingenuous, although I suspect it is a flat-out lie. They have sold tutorials teaching people how to import Genesis figures, they have sold programs to help people import Genesis figures, they have long-form threads supporting people who wish to do so, and let's never forget that it was DAZ who first started selling Poser-compatible figures and built compatibility into their software, and has a Poser exporter built into their current software. DAZ would have no legs to stand on if Bondware returned the favour. This is about Bondware wanting a walled garden where they are suppliers of unique Poser content. I find this completely inscrutable, as they also sell Genesis content. But whatever their business motivation, like abandoning Python 2, it is a tremendous disservice to their customers, many of whom are desperate for the capability, especially as so much original Bondware Poser content is of significantly worse quality than the content sold at DAZ, who has much higher quality controls. Yes, it would require some jiggery-pokery to convert DAZ's iRay textures, as the format is considerably different to Cycles or traditional Poser surface construction, although their 3D Light format would be easier to convert. But even if Poser only imported the models with morphs and the absolute most basic maps, it would be a huge step forwards. The fact is, DAZ makes the best figures, and Bondware doesn't want customers going anywhere but them for content, even if that ultimately drives customers away from them entirely. It's so short-sighted as to be farcical. Another omission is a native Skydome with high dynamic range HDRI support. HDRI images provide a much wider brightness range than standard JPEG images, for instance, and are available in a range of file formats. These can then be used to provide subtle lighting, reflection maps and backgrounds. As it stands, HDRI image support in Poser 12 is broken, but even when it works there is no easy way to attach them to a Skydome and add an appropriate distant light. The program still has no alignment or distribution tools, which I would have thought was about as basic as it gets for organising multiple objects in a scene. A minor but useful feature that I would like to see is right-click renaming of items in the content library. Although it's easy enough to use the Show in Explorer option to navigate to files, when a single piece of content generally comprises of 3 separate files, a single option that renames them all, as well as any references within those files, would be very handy. A far more consequential quality of life feature would be an inverse kinematics icon to simplify turning on and off kinematics for figure limbs. It would also be nice to be able to relabel geometry names. At the moment, the program assigns every model 2 names, the name used in the menus to select it, Ford car for instance, and the internal name of the underlying geometry that was used for the car, completed car model for instance. Another useful feature for content creators would be to never save the geometry with the prop, rather to always simply refer to the original OBJ file or create a new one. This simplifies content creation and reduces memory overhead. Poser already provides the option to save external morph targets, so it's surprising that this feature is not standard. Incidentally, when you use the Intel denoiser, the program always saves two images, the original and the modified version. Can we please have the option to turn that off so that only the final image is saved, especially when saving an image sequence? Alternately, give us a standalone version of the denoiser to use on original files. The program has a panel of interface, camera and pose dots, 9 each respectively. These enable you to quickly store and apply what may be temporary options. You can permanently save cameras and poses in the libraries, but not interface workspace layouts. And you are unlikely to need more than half a dozen workspaces per room, so you will probably continue to use the same dots for years. Therefore, it would be nice if you could label the interface dots so that their label appears as a rollover tip. Mine would be Main, No Library, Hierarchy and Animation. As it stands, you simply have to remember what interface layout each button pertains to. As a content creator, the ability to reorient axes would be great. Suppose you create an object that is oriented at 45 degrees when you make it. You cannot reorient Poser's axis to 45 degrees, so that the object's X, Y and Z directions are relative to that 45-degree angle. This is vital when you are creating dependent parts, say a piston on the end of an arm. Without it, you can never have a single dial that moves them in a single relative axis, if the sub-object was not perfectly aligned along the XYZ when it was created. I have to say, Bondware's marketing for this version has been inscrutable, almost incomprehensibly bad. They failed almost totally to generate any sense of excitement for it. There are no rendered images or animations with any wow factor. Their What's New videos leave out some of the most important features, and the entire release has been more like something that they're somewhat embarrassed about. You might argue that the program has so few major features that Bondware has nothing to fanfare, especially as the program is so bugged, but it would be unfair to dismiss it out of hand. The speed improvements are game-changing, and you'd have to spend at least £700 on a decent graphics card to come close to this level of boost if you wanted to achieve it with hardware alone. The denoiser is also a valuable if imperfect tool for rapid scene previews. When version 11 was released with its physically based render engine, we all hoped for a huge leap forwards in realism, and the program was capable of that, but it was so complicated to wire up the cycles materials, I'm sure that many people gave up once they were past the initial excitement. The new principled node promises to give people new hope, enabling them to spend more time experimenting and fine-tuning materials, and less time working out how to create them in the first place. It still feels to me as though lighting is one area that the program is lacking, and this has a knock-on in terms of its inability to achieve true photorealism. Speaking of which, there are two crippling infinite lighting bugs. The first randomly turns the light effect off, despite the light being turned on in the properties panel. The second randomly disabled specularity effects, forcing you to use alternate lighting when animating. The lack of microfacet displacement is a really huge disappointment to me, and it greatly complicates Superfly displacement modelling, while increasing the system burden. We were spoiled by having it in Firefly all these years, and I can't blame Bondware for not implementing a feature that even the eggheads at the Blender Foundation and Discrete have yet to master. So, should you buy Poser 12? If you have a previous version and don't mind waiting while Bondware fixes the multitude of bugs, and rendering speed is important to you, then I'd say yes, definitely. For $129, about £95, the program represents good value, although to be honest it feels more like a point upgrade than a whole version. It's sorely lacking in major new scene creation or figure handling features, making it perhaps the weakest in terms of new capabilities, yet paradoxically the most consequential new version in the program's past 5 or 6 versions for maximising your existing content. The speed improvement is utterly game-changing. Unfortunately, so is the switch to Python 3. Should you pay $249 for the full program? It's hard to justify unless you are a content creator. DAZ Studio produces much better quality renders, supports the most popular figures and content, and is completely free. Straight out of the box, total beginners can produce great photoreal images, and whilst its animation is less intuitive, Its animate system significantly simplifies the process of creating complex animations. But then I come back to render speed improvements again. I suppose it depends how much value you place upon those. I can't imagine many first-time purchasers being willing to pay $249 for a feature that they didn't even know they needed.
If you have rendered with DAZ Studio, you'll know how excruciatingly slow and lacking in feedback that program's iRay renderer is. So you may value Poser 12's multitude of render speed enhancements that will produce renders orders of magnitude faster, especially if you are using an Optics graphics card.
In my opinion, Poser's shader and material creation system is both easier to use and much more powerful. It also has a far more versatile and friendly rendering engine, as well as features such as its cloth room, bullet physics, hair room, morphing creator and far more, all of which are easier to use than DAZ's, which are obscurely named and hidden beneath multiple layers of incomprehensible menus. I'd like to make it clear, I love Poser, and would use it in preference over DAZ Studio 9 times out of 10. But the program has fallen badly behind in the technology race, and Bondware needs to undertake some serious work to justify its retail price. I don't have a great deal of faith in Bondware's business competence, but I am open to be persuaded otherwise, and I am hopeful that this is just the start of a glorious new age in Poser's future. I just hope that Bondware will remember that they need to provide value to the users while serving their own financial interests. Watch this space. I purchased my review copy of Poser with my own money, but upon Bondware's agreement, as a courtesy to them, this review was submitted to their marketing manager for fact-checking and comments. They chose not to return that courtesy, providing neither, nor any further response. A choice that seems emblematic of their flaccid community building and outreach ethos. Perhaps if I was in charge of marketing over there, I'd want to bury justified criticism too. Moreover, after receiving this review, they opted to publish a press release that sought to massage the complete non-benefits of crippling the Python 2 scripting language. Not a promising beginning.